Hey, what's up? This is Mr. Ippolito. With me is Mr. Han. We got some students hanging out with us here, and we're going to do the quick recap video in case you weren't able to join us this morning. We're learning today about abolitionists in America. Actually, yeah, we'll just jump right into the lesson because I don't need to do all the other stuff, Mr. Han. This is the most important part right here. Okay, so showed a photo of the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society. Abolitionists are people who wanted to abolish or immediately get rid of slavery. Began in New England and Pennsylvania in the late 1700s, right after the Constitution was ratified, and it was fueled by the Second Great Awakening. Just like so many other reform movements of the 1800s were fueled by this Christian desire to make the world a better place, to make the country a better place, to have people treated more equally, to have better treatment for all Americans. It was the temperance movement that wanted to get rid of the consumption of alcohol. It was the women's rights movement. It was the abolitionist movement, the movement to have better treatment for the mentally ill and the people in prison. And it was just like, let's make our world a better place, all fueled by this revival of Christianity in the mid 1800s. Okay, discussion question where we thought, well, at the Constitutional Convention, they were kind of kicking it down the road, kicking the issue of slavery down the road, kind of like when, sometimes if there's a really hard conversation, a really courageous conversation you have to have with a family member or a friend, and you really don't, it's uncomfortable, you really don't want to have that conversation. This was kind of like what America was like right at the beginning of our nation, is we really didn't want to have the conversation about slavery, so we just kept kind of postponing until finally it erupts in violence in the Civil War. Okay, so there were three different categories of abolitionists. There were the talkers, the writers, and the doers. And in your assignment, you're going to choose one category that you're going to focus in on, kind of hone in on and learn more about. So these are the talkers. The Grimke sisters. They were the daughters of a South Carolina slave owner. They moved to Philadelphia to lecture about the evils of slavery. They knew firsthand how bad slavery was because they grew up on a plantation. They also fought for women's rights. And then there's Frederick Douglass. He was the son of a white father and a slave mother, meaning he was born a slave. If you are born of a slave mother, then you are born a slave, even if your father is white. And his father, by the way, was his mother's slave owner. So, but Frederick Douglass is an amazing individual. He spoke so eloquently. He was such a good public speaker. People could hardly believe that he was actually, like, he used to be a slave. He also wrote his own autobiography. He traveled all throughout Great Britain and the United States, giving speeches about the evils of slavery, also published an abolitionist newspaper called the North Star. So you might decide that it was the talkers of abolitionism who were the most influential. We're gonna give you some resources to dive a little bit deeper to learn more about the Grimke sisters and Frederick Douglass. The next category are the writers. So the abolitionists who worked to end slavery through their writings. Two abolitionist examples we're gonna give you in this category. We've got Harriet Beecher Stowe. She wrote a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin, all about the evils of slavery. It was a very detailed novel. It was it was so touching and so emotional and so heartbreaking. Here was this slave. His name was Uncle Tom, an older slave. His cruel master, Simon Legree. And even on his deathbed, in the story, Uncle Tom forgave his master, forgave him for beating him. And so here was this really, really cruel master and this really, really kind and loving and forgiving slave. This was at the same time, Queen Victoria was the Queen of England at the time, Queen of Great Britain. And she was known for being serious and never showing emotion. And she openly cried. She openly wept when she read this book. She was so moved by it. So words were very powerful. This book was very, very, very powerful. It would go on to become the second highest selling book in the United States right after the Bible. So that's a little bit more about Uncle Tom's Cabin. The next writer that we talked about was William Lloyd Garrison. He started the abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. He once publicly burned a copy of the Constitution because it allowed slavery. He was so passionate. He says, "I am in earnest," meaning I'm very serious. "I will not retreat 1 inch." He believed that slavery should end immediately, and there should be no compromise whatsoever. Books and newspapers, super powerful because there's no internet, there's no TV, there's no radio, there's no other way, there's no other form of mass media besides books and newspapers. So America was super literate at this time. Well, if you were allowed to read and write. Slaves, of course, were outlawed. They couldn't. It was against the law for slaves to read and write. But white Americans, super high literacy rate in the United States during this time because books and newspapers were the #1 source of information for them. And then finally, the doers. These are the abolitionists who actually took action against slavery. So the first one is Harriet Tubman. And she escaped slavery but returned to the South 19 different times to save others. She was the main conductor on the Underground Railroad, where she brought over 300 slaves to freedom. Slave owners offered $40,000. They put a $40,000 bounty on her head to get her, like for her capture, which today would be worth like $1.2 million. They never caught her. She escaped to freedom, ultimately living the rest of her life in Canada after she ended up helping so many other slaves to escape. And then this guy, John Brown, here before God, I dedicate my life to the destruction of slavery. He wanted to take action. He believed slavery was wrong and that it was his Christian duty to take action to end it. Murdered a group of 5 pro-slavery men in 1855 in Kansas, hacked them to death with broadswords. And then finally, his last act in 1859, he went to seize a federal arsenal. That's where you keep weapons, guns, and gunpowder and bullets, in the hopes of starting a massive slave revolt. He didn't start a slave revolt, but he did anger a lot of the white slave owners around him, and that ultimately led to him being tried and convicted for treason in the state of Virginia. He became a martyr for the abolitionist cause. A martyr is someone who dies for what they believe in, right? And ultimately, he will be called the meteor of the Civil War. A meteor, if you remember from medieval Europe, meteors, shooting stars, were seen as like powerful symbols of something big, some major thing is going to happen soon in the future. And so that was John Brown. Okay, so this is the assignment. You're going to create an abolitionist scrapbook page. Choose either the talkers, the writers, or the doers of abolitionism. You're going to make a scrapbook page to represent the people that you think were the most effective in the fight to end slavery. This is my example. And there are some additional resources. You can watch these YouTube videos to find out more. And there you go. So have a great day, and that's the end of our video.